Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome to the Human Risk podcast. No, your ears don't deceive you. This isn't Christian Hunt. Instead, it's me, Mark Heywood. Christian has kindly asked me to take over hosting duties for this episode, as today's guest is, well, your usual host, Christian Hunt. Unless you've been living in a cave, and to be honest, given the state of the world, I wouldn't blame you, Christian's written a book, and I'm delighted to be here today to ask him about it. So for once, in approximately 250 episodes, we're turning the tables and the spotlight onto the man himself. So please welcome to the Human Risk podcast today's guest, Christian Hunt. So Christian, why the book? Why now?
Well, I just thought, Mark, I've been talking to lots of people about it, and there was enough content there to put together in a book. So I thought, why not write one? How hard can it be?
Yes, well, very, actually, I think is the conventional wisdom to that. But this is not about conventional wisdom. I love the fact that you've done it. So many congratulations on it.
Thank you.
It's now out there in the wild, and you use that phrase "in the wild" a lot. This book is chock full of examples of people who have had success in getting people to do the things they want them to do. One of the things I wanted to focus on is that it's unfair for me to say this is a book of isolated examples. But what you're saying is that what we need, or what you seem to be saying, is that if we can use this book as a manifesto, then these isolated examples start to become joined up. And rather than just having one-off examples of someone that's been clever and found a way that works in terms of human science and of human risk and behavioural science, if we all did the things in the book, we could solve infinitely more problems. Is that fair?
Yes, I think the reason I like the "in the wild" formulation is, as I work with people, it's much easier to talk about situations that don't involve, so things that we all recognise from our day-to-day existence. And so I just wanted to pick things that would bring the ideas that I talk about alive. But you're absolutely right. The idea behind it is to say, here's a way to think about solving problems that involve persuading people to do something or not do something. And so the stories just are designed, as you say, to bring the frameworks and the ideas that I put in there to life so that you can sort of think, oh, okay, I see where he's going with that.
One of the examples you use is of a bicycle manufacturer. And they had many, many problems in getting their product to their customers without the product being damaged. For some reason, these products were getting damaged in transit. So somebody in the company, I assume, had this smart idea of, instead of having a picture of a bike on the cardboard box, it said something like large screen TV inside, which had rather a dramatic effect, didn't it? It reduced the number of things that were damaged in transit.
What's fascinating about it wasn't actually dishonest. They didn't ever say there's a TV in here. They just put a picture of a TV on the box. And yeah, you're right. Bikes were getting damaged in transit. And if something goes missing in transit, it becomes the courier company's problem. If something gets damaged in transit, it becomes the manufacturer's problem. And so they were trying to solve this thing of having to recall these bikes and deal with the obviously unhappy customers who waited in many cases some time for the delivery. And so how can we do that? And it was literally, they were looking and thinking, well, what else gets transported of a similar size? Well, TVs, they don't seem to get damaged. So let's do something very clever, which is give the impression that this has a TV in it and the box is about the same size without lying. And magically, the delivery people concluded there was a TV, therefore it was fragile.
Has your life has it been taken over now by you observing things in the wild that make you stop and think about what the person who has written the notice or the sign or the warning or the advert is trying to achieve versus actually there may be a different way of doing it? Do you find yourself, does it take much longer for you to get from A to B because you stop halfway through and take a photo of something and say, look at this is really interesting?
Yeah, I get in lots of trouble. So because you spot something, it's a little bit like, the Sixth Sense, and I don't want to spoil that for people, but people who've seen the movie will know what I'm talking about. There's a lens that I look at the world through now. And so I'm constantly looking out for it, which is exhausting. But it also means you stop and take pictures of random stuff. And the number of times I've been harangued in supermarkets. Supermarkets, for some reason, don't like people taking pictures inside them. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'm constantly on the lookout for more examples. Because I think often we walk past stuff, and if we stopped a little bit, there's sort of people deliberately going more slowly, paying attention, notice your breathing, all that sort of stuff. So I think I'm just doing the same thing, slowing the world down a bit. But yeah, I have been late for things as a result of spotting something amazing that I just had to either watch unfold or think about.
I thought of this book very recently. The building in which I rent a desk in a studio with another filmmaker. It was being painted. The floors, they'd done the walls of the interior, and I always laugh when I see a sign that says wet paint, because I always think of that great cartoon that says this is not an instruction, which I think is very clever. But the building management had said, and it was May Day, so it wasn't for the coronation, it was the May Day bank holiday. They said the studio will be shut from, I think it was Sunday morning until Tuesday morning, so that we can paint all the floors. Now, this is a big building, and it was not a surprise to anyone, least of all me, to arrive on Tuesday morning to find that the paint hadn't had enough time to dry. And so the floors ended up looking worse, having been painted and not left to dry, after everyone had trampled all over it on Tuesday morning, than they did before it had actually been painted. So they then sent out a very apologetic note saying, we're very sorry. So the King's coronation weekend comes around, and they said, all right, it'll now be closed from Saturday evening through to Tuesday morning. And I thought, is that enough time? Well, let's just assume that it is enough time. And of course, it worked, and it was absolutely great. But it struck me that so often we leap to we need a couple of guys with a couple of tins of paint and a couple of paintbrushes to paint this, and it will all be all right, without actually thinking that, well, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to make the interior look nice, right? So we're going to paint that. Great. And in making it look nice and not giving ourselves enough time, we've ended up making it look infinitely worse than it was. Now, your book is chock full of these examples extrapolated to infinity and beyond, right? Because we're not talking about painting a building. You start by talking about the Oscars ceremony in which they used the wrong envelope. You talk about Kwaku Adebole, who you and I have both come across in our former lives. How many more examples have you got? You could write a dozen books, I'm sure.
Yeah. It was what do I leave out rather than what's there, because I think there are just so many examples of, once you start thinking anything that happens in the world has human decision making involved in it. I always say when something goes wrong, there's a human component either causing the problem or making it worse. And so when you look at that, this stuff is all around. I mean, our whole lives, every single thing we're doing, every moment, a human has played a part in designing the environment that we're in. And so, it's almost sort of information overload. So what I tried to do is find a collection of stories, some of which involve me, some of which involve famous incidents you'll hear, and then some quirky things that I just thought were suitable. But you're right, there's a serious volume issue here. And one of the things which I only realised after I'd written the book was that the vast majority of stories involve men, which is something that I wasn't consciously thinking about. I was just, let's grab some high-profile things. And I think that plays into an interesting question. So I'm now trying to find examples, but men have been in leadership positions for a long time, and so that's a natural dynamic of the patriarchal society that we've got. But so that's the one thing I wish I could have pulled a few more of those, because it's not, men aren't the only ones that make mistakes, you know. But they're more high-profile ones because of the history. But I keep collecting these things and just tried to find things that I thought got the point across as best I could.
Yeah, and there are so many of them that you sort of think, have we lost the plot? And early on, you talk about employing smart people and about having contracts, and actually that the contract is a fallacy, because you only really need the contract when there is some kind of dispute, at the end of it. So we spend all this time finding or trying to find really smart people, and then we give them a whole bunch of completely futile bits of training that we ask them to do in order to prove that they are not going to sell the crown jewels or sink the boat or whatever, whatever it is. If we could just use AI, right? If that's the route we're going down. Because what we're doing is we're saying we're going to take smart people and we're going to turn them into people who tick boxes, right? Now, I understand why corporations do that, because they need to have some kind of record that somebody like you or somebody like me has understood that there is a difference between selling a product to a genuine customer and giving money to the brother of the Saudi defense minister, right? That was always the classic, right? Which of these two things is wrong, right? And you think, well, I know this infinitely, but training has got so complex now that they almost, and you talk about this in the book, they almost make you click on the screen to prove that you haven't fallen asleep, right? Whilst you're doing it. So why are we hiring grown-ups and then treating them like children?
I think it's very odd when if we think, I always looked at recruitment processes. The traditional recruitment is let's ask you some questions about who you are and your personality. And then particularly in the sort of high pressure environments of, I think, banking or law or those sorts of things, but you spend a lot of time recruiting people with personality and then give them zero time whatsoever to actually do those things going forward. And so I think there's a disconnect between, we want really smart people, but we're also terrified about what that means. And so we try and constrain it. And that for me frustrates me, because I think it's a real waste of human potential. What's the point in hiring super smart people and then assuming that they're idiots? Although you can sort of see where it comes from, because we all are capable of being idiots. And so I can see that we sometimes need help in our decision making, but I think what we don't do is think that through properly. I talk in the book about, we design for how we would like people to behave rather than how they are likely to behave. And I think if we started to look realistically, where do people need help with things, and where is it common sense? And it seems to me that we discard common sense and we just assume that we assume the worst in people.
This book, you could have done this book very differently. You could have simply curated a whole bunch of TikTok or YouTube videos of people. And I give you a very specific example, right? You see this online all the time. There'll be a dog and there'll be a treat, and the treat will be put in front of the dog, and the human will tell the dog to stay, don't touch, stay. And the human will leave the room. And guess what you think happens next, right? The dog eats the treat, right? Because that is what the dog is likely to do. Right. It's a classic case of behavioural science. If you tell the dog not to do something, it will probably obey you because it's been trained to do that. But the second you clear off, it will go, I have no recollection of my previous instruction. I'm now going to... That's what we're saying. It's right. Like, there's just a human version of that, isn't it, in this book?
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example. And what's strange is we know that in animals. But for some reason, we think people behave differently, and it's this strange thing where we endow people with a level of sophistication, and then we don't. And I find that very bizarre. So yeah, no, I agree. I think there's a lot we can learn from looking at the way we treat animals and the lessons we learn from that in terms of human behavior. Because ultimately, we are animals. We have base instincts that we follow, and so yeah, I did think about just sort of telling stories, but I wanted it also to be a so what, because you can spend a lot of time watching these videos online and going, yeah, people are dumb, people do stupid things, people do amusing things. What can we do with that? And so the purpose behind the book really was to at least try and provide some structures that people could start to think about how to recognize when we maybe do things that are not smart from a behavioral science perspective, and what better solutions.
We talk about conventional wisdom, and we've talked about taking a contrary point of view. Now, conventional wisdom would lead you to assume that in preparation for this interview, I had read the book. So I did consider not reading it, because that would be the contrary view. But I didn't. I ignored that, and I went with the conventional, and I read it. And one of the things that I was delighted to see is that you're not just, in fact, you're not even just, I'll retract the word just, you're not pointing the finger of blame at others who have transgressed and who have done stupid things. You include yourself many times as an example of someone that has been made to appear foolish because you have been foolish. And one of the examples you use is on the Eurostar, and it's about, but I was delighted to learn that there is some subculture on Facebook in which there is the rail passengers group all over the internet. But somebody was asking the question, where do I get labels for my bag? And you said, you don't, it says you need one, but actually you don't. And then was it a member of staff actually joined the thread and said, well, you do need a label because actually if we have to evacuate the train in an emergency, you can't bring anything with you. And therefore, if your bag isn't labeled, there is a very high chance that you will never see it again, which makes perfect sense. But that really landed with a thud with you, didn't it?
Yeah, well, I thought I was being super smart and like, well, let me tell you the way it is. And here's a stupid rule I'm going to point it out to you. And then you realise actually that when someone explains it to you, that there is a lot of common sense. And I think often when we impose rules on people, we don't explain it to them. We just assume because we know why if we're the rule writer, we know why the rule's there. And we don't think about the fact that people might not realise why it is. And so if something seems dumb to us, we're more likely to ignore it. And so, yeah, so I was very proud of the fact, well, I've never put a label on my bag. Why would you do that? Don't slavishly follow stupid rules. And then suddenly I'm like, oh, that makes a ton of sense, right? Because I do not want to lose my bag.
Yeah, absolutely. In preparation, I didn't just read the book. I thought about things in my own life that I could share that were either good or bad or terrible examples of behavioural science and human risk. And one, quite recently, just a process, because it happened very recently. So in the last 6 months, I have renewed both my passport and my driving licence. And obviously, this is a once every 10-year activity, so you forget what it was like and then you're reminded of it. Now, actually, if you can get hold of a passport form and you can get to, the passport office, it's actually a fairly easy but expensive process. But my driving license expired and I got the form through and I went onto the website and it asked me for my passport number and a bunch of other stuff. And it then obviously arrives and it takes the photo from your passport, so it's as up to date as it can be. It's a very easy process, but right at the end of it is a brilliant example of somebody who's actually thought these things through. It says, do you want to register as an organ donor? And it's brilliant in the sense that you think that's a natural point at which they can ask you this question because they're asking you for a whole bunch of other information as well. But it's also reinforcing the fact that actually driving might be quite dangerous,
right?
And on the basis that there are accidents and you may be in an accident, would you want to at some point, and we hope it never happens, but if it did, would you want to help save a life by donating your organs? Which I actually thought was very, very smart, and then made me think about a whole bunch of other things about, actually, I said, yes, I want to do that. And then it says, well, have you told your family? And you think, wow, there's a whole bunch of stuff I hadn't thought through here. I was just going online to do some admin to get a new driving license. All of a sudden, I'm updating my will, right. And so I just think that's actually a very cleverly thought through process. It's about finding more of those, isn't it? That's what we need to do.
I think that's a great example of timing. That on its own, that question could be intrusive. That question could be as extra hassle. But you're right. If you're already in a process where it's asking questions along those lines, why not tack that onto the end? And I do think we design things really appalling. We don't think about the human that has to go through the process. And so, as you've rightly pointed out there, I don't want to say customer because it often doesn't feel like you are a customer, but the sort of experience of going through that, that feels perfectly normal and perfectly natural. And I think there's so many processes in the world that are designed in ways that don't feel natural. Now, sometimes unnatural processes are there for a deliberate reason. I talk in the book about airport security. Why does that exist? Well, on the face of it, airport security exists to stop bad people doing bad things. But it's also there to reassure the rest of us who aren't trying to do bad things. And so they deliberately make it slightly inefficient so that you remember it and notice it. And so there's an example of something called friction, where we make the process a bit less efficient. But there are so many examples where that's just deployed without thinking. And I love the way you talked about that, because you sort of went, well, this just feels perfectly normal. Right? You're not offended by it. You're not irritated by it. Actually, you wind up going, that's really helpful. And I think if we got timing is just one of those factors where if we got the timing, or we thought about, is this the best possible opportunity? And we could probably push people a bit further. I'm not about saying let's make life as easy as possible for people. I think organizations and governments could probably push things further if they chose their moment right and they chose the way to do it. And so it's really about understanding things, not from the perspective of the people writing the rules or creating the process, but what does it feel like to go through this? And the moment you start thinking in those terms, you can identify lots of things that one would change. And it's not big changes, right? It's relatively small things.
My favourite example, I think, in the book is the humble stop sign, and the very subtle but powerful difference between the word stop, which has huge urgency, and the phrase no entry, which is kind of neither here nor there, isn't it? But the stop is a very deliberate bad stuff will happen if you don't stop, whereas no entry is you say that, but I could if I wanted to go down it. That's a very powerful example, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think there are certain contexts where we're really good at this. So I think traffic signs, generally speaking, is we don't notice half the time when we drive down roads. We notice when it's irritating or silly. And roadworks is a great example where somebody's just come along and put something in place for a temporary period of time. They haven't really thought it through. We've all been at those temporary traffic lights that take far too long for the junction. And so we notice those things. And I think what that tells us is that generally speaking, the people that design roads do a pretty good job at doing those things. And so I love traffic as an example. I also talk about, if you look at sort of roads, they focus very heavily. Yes, we hold drivers accountable for accidents, but we also look and say, if there's a stretch of road and there's lots of accidents happening here, then that tells us that there's something wrong with the stretch of road. You're not going to have that many, lots and lots of drivers having accidents. There's some problem with the road. And so they restructure junctions, put more signage up, maybe put features into the road so that people recognise that they may be driving too quickly. In other words, make people more aware of the dangers that are there. And so when I look at that, I think that's a really smart analogy for the rest of the world. We often kind of go, when something goes wrong, oh, it's those idiot people. But if lots of people are doing something, then that tells us there's something in the environment. And I think the traffic or the sign analogy is a good one. We've all seen dumb signs telling us to do stupid things, but there's thousands of signs that we see every single day that we don't notice, that they're just there. And I love those ones that we don't notice, that just get us to behave in a particular way without us even being aware of it. That's kind of what, I think there's so many examples in life where we're intruded upon, where natural flow of things is interrupted. And sometimes for very good reason, like airport security, but very often not. And so I want people who are in charge of creating environments and designing processes to be a bit more thoughtful about it.
Is there an argument? And if there is, it's not touched on in the book because it's more an expose of things that have been implemented that make no sense or do make sense. But is there an argument, Christian, to say, could we try and make something look much more risky than it actually is to encourage human beings to assess for themselves how dangerous a particular thing is? So one of the best examples I can give you is a supermarket car park is essentially a free-for-all, right? Nobody knows who has right of way. Nobody knows really if there's a speed limit. Nobody really looks. Everyone's charging around with trolleys. There are so many things that you could either get knocked over by or knock over, right? That actually we sort of exist in this state of constant alert and constant bewilderment of what's going on. We have created a society in which we put up railings, we put up stop signs, we put up traffic lights. What if we took all those away? What do you think would happen? Because surely things like, we've talked about this before, the implementation of seatbelts, right? People feel safer, therefore they may be encouraged to take more risks. What if we said, forget all that, right? You do what you want. What do you think would happen in that sort of society?
The Netherlands are really good on this. There are lots of examples of things in the Netherlands where they try and create that dynamic. So there are roads, and there's one they've borrowed that technique here for Exhibition Road in London, where they've removed all of the markings. There's no signs, no markings, and pedestrians intermingle with cars. And it is that free-for-all that you talked about. And that seems to work because everybody's paying attention, because suddenly you can't start justifying it. Well, I've got right of way. Well, I don't know who's got right of way here. And so that is, I think, giving people a sense of responsibility. People generally will take a bit more responsibility, if you like. There's a culture of not wearing cycle helmets in the Netherlands, which is interesting. Now, partly that's because they have segregated cycleways. And so the big swathes of the risk of being hit by a car are removed. But you could still do yourself a serious amount of damage if you came off a bicycle, particularly with some of the e-bikes, right? If you fell off a bike at high speed, that's going to cause you quite a lot of damage, but nobody wears a helmet. And the argument about wearing helmets is that the people feel safer, so they take more risks. So if you remove that safety, and they haven't removed it by law, but it's a social norm that's evolved, people do pay more attention. There's always exceptions to rules, but generally speaking, if we're aware of something, think about modern cars. It's interesting the way the soundproofing there, you have no sense of the speed at which you're driving. Whereas if you drive a sports car, put the roof down, you suddenly have a greater sense of what's happening. And so the theory is you pay more attention. And I think it's an interesting one to explore, because I think we often create rules for, here's a risk, let's just put a rule in place, or some sort of process to mitigate the risk. And you're right, the more it feels safe, the challenge with that is the more risk we take. So ironically, every time they introduce safety features in cars, people drive faster because it feels like a safer activity. So I think for me, that's a dynamic we should play with. And I'm not saying we play with matters of life and death, but in many circumstances, we put sort of kid gloves on people when actually maybe that's not a good idea.
We're recording this at Abbey Road Studios in London. And if I walk out of the door, up the ramp, out the gate and turn right, within 30 seconds from leaving this studio, I could be at one of the most famous stretches of road in the world, the iconic crossing from the Beatles' album. when we walked past it earlier on, there were, as there always are, groups of people waiting patiently to take their turn to walk out in front of traffic and blindly assuming the traffic will stop so they can get that selfie, right? In that regard, everybody's focus is on getting the photo, right? Which means that the burden of risk falls on the drivers, right? I'm astonished there haven't been more accidents on that stretch of road because there were literally 15 young people waiting to take that shot, meaning that you can only get 6 of them on the crossing at any one point, meaning it's going to take quite a long period of time, meaning the capacity for accidents is very high, and yet it's not. Is that because we are confronted with something that actually this is going to be a bit risky? Whereas if one person, blindly walked out, it might be a very different situation. But there you're approaching it going, if you've driven this road before, you will know that there will be a ton of people trying to cross that road at that point, right?
Yeah, I think it'd be an interesting thought experiment. Imagine that the crossing was only known about by some people, right? So it wasn't the Beatles from way back when. It was an artist that the average cab driver or driver hasn't heard of. Then you'd have a different situation. But I think because it's so famous, everybody is conscious of that. And so you're probably unlikely to be driving through that part of town without being aware. There'll be a small number of drivers that have never heard of the Beatles who've got lost or something. But it's not a main thoroughfare. So I'd say the average driver and the average pedestrian that is aware of that very unusual context. I mean, I guess the bottom line is it's a crossing, so drivers have got to be careful anyway. So imagine that they'd done it on just a normal stretch of road. I guess you'd have to probably put a crossing in place now to manage that. But I think it's a good illustration of where the norms of what might happen at a pedestrian crossing are changed. I mean, weirdly, right? Why would putting it on an album cover make any difference whatsoever? But it's become this thing. And so I think I would say there the norms are disapplied, and we've got a very, very unusual set of circumstances that everybody is aware of. But if you had some people that weren't aware of it, and I have this, I spend half my time in Germany, half my time here. And when I shift countries, I have about a 48-hour recalibration period of lots of things. And pedestrian crossings is one of them. So in the UK, if there's no traffic coming, you don't wait for the little green man before you cross the road, unless you've got a major, major road. But the average road you will cross. In Germany, it's the exact opposite. You get told off if you're not waiting. So little old ladies will shout at you if you walk across the road because that's not the done thing. And so for about 24 to 48 hours, every time I change countries, I'm in the wrong mindset. So I've often stood here looking like an idiot in the UK, not crossing. Or in Germany, it's worse in Germany because obviously then I'm doing the thing you shouldn't do, as opposed to not doing something that you could. And it's fascinating, those dynamics that are at play and the norms that drive our behaviours and how we think about the world. And so I think the humble crossing plays into a host of dynamics that we have. We all know what the normal behaviour is, unless we're transplanted to somewhere where that normal behaviour doesn't happen. This is a prime example of that.
I wanted to talk about actually the notion of well-intentioned behaviour that actually ends up being quite destructive, and then give you some counterexamples of it. I interviewed somebody recently, a guy called becuase, who has written a book that's essentially a guide for how to be happy and happier. But in it, he talks about things that he has experienced. He is a young, gay, black male. And he talks about both of those things in isolation and then those two things together. But he talks about a former boss that he had who came up with this very well-intentioned idea to get the team to bond in the run-up to Christmas. And the boss asked people to bring in a photograph of themselves as a child, and they would put them on the wall, and you would have to guess who was who, right? It sounds incredibly well-intentioned until it was pointed out by my guest, who I interviewed, that he was the only black person in the team. And therefore, in this team of 20, it would have been immediately obvious which photo was his, which you might think, well, does that really matter? And he said it mattered to him because it was essentially scratching away at his own identity and his own individuality. And it was almost saying that it wasn't important that people would be able to identify him because it's fine. We're just playing a game, right? And it meant a huge amount to him. And the reason I bring this up is I am left-handed, which means I live in a right-handed person's world. Many, many things are right-handed. For example, going through the tube barriers, the thing you put your card on is on the right-hand side, meaning that if I want to hold my card on my left-hand side, I'm reaching across. So the whole world is designed for a predominantly right-handed universe. There have been very, very few occasions, and I can count them on one hand, in my entire life that being left-handed has been a source of joy to me. 2 of them were in Hong Kong, and both times were in a restaurant. And I was served my meal, the person I was with was served their meal, and the chopsticks were on the right-hand side of the plate. So I moved the chopsticks to the left-hand side of the plate. And on 2 occasions that this has happened, the restaurant manager has rushed over, profusely apologised for any offence caused, taken the dish away and brought it back, dressed left to right, not right to left.
Wow.
And I felt amazing about this, right? Because I don't know whether it was Asian culture or Asian sensitivity, but the causing of offence is a mortal sin and must be punishable by death. But he could not apologise enough on both occasions. The other, and this is a tiny, tiny thing, and I still have it because I'm so proud of it. When I opened my very first bank account with the Royal Bank of Scotland, I was asked which hand I used, and I said I'm left-handed, and they sent me a left-handed checkbook, and it opens the other way round. So the stubs are on the right, not the left. So I don't have to, as you go down the checkbook,
Right.
I don't have to write over that. And it's a tiny thing, but it means so much to me because I live in a world in which a saucepan can only be poured with a right hand because the lip is on one side, not the other side. Branding on tankards, for example, if I hold it in my right hand, the branding faces out. If I hold it in my left hand, it faces in, which means I can see it. But the point is that other people need to be able to see it. And I wondered, in preparation for this, how much when we think about rules, we are not thinking about everyone. We're trying to generalize. I know you can't get 100% compliance, and in the book, you actually argue that that's not desirable. That's not what we want. But how much do you think we think about everyone, or are we just going, do you know what, 70% is sort of good enough? I think we miss the fringes a little.
I think that's really interesting. And I'm struck by so many examples in life where we exclude people. And so whether that's the old thing about, I can't pronounce your name, so I'm just going to call you something else. That sort of dreadful kind of colonialist attitude is it's a bit too difficult. And these things really matter. And I think I'm right-handed, and I'd never thought about all of those things until you point it out. But once you point it out, and annoyingly, you've now given me another thing to look out for. Thank you. But it's fascinating, right? Because we don't do that. And you see that with, I think society has an issue with that. So it's male-dominated society. So there's lots of things there that are designed. And you've read Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, where she talks about, bulletproof vests that are designed for men's body, crash test dummies that are designed around the male body rather than. And so lots of examples like that. And I think rules, the same thing applies, is that we often, particularly multinationals, will design something that works in head office that might be applicable in the countries there. And, you and I have worked for multinationals, and you can sort of see what's been invented in head office that seems like a good idea, and then try and deploy that globally. And you get some appalling outcomes because it doesn't work culturally, or the situation that it envisages doesn't apply. And so, yeah, I think we like to sort of simplified models of the world, and the world is a complicated place. And so we write rules for, we don't contemplate things that we can't think of, technological developments. I'm fascinated by things like cryptocurrencies. Rules that you write for physical currency might not apply to cryptocurrencies. Dynamics that, and that's why I think we have to be mindful of the fact not everybody is the same. Different cultures have different norms. People read words, there's lost in translation. That phrase suggests that we often misunderstand each other. And I think we've got less of an excuse nowadays. We're aware of all of and we can do something about it, particularly with digital processes. We can create things. It's, physical words. So you talked about the tankard or the checkbook. That requires somebody to design something that's different. Now, I think they should, because I think that's very important. And the fact that you're so overjoyed with it, on the one hand, I find really sad, because it shouldn't be a joyful moment. It should just be normal. But at least it illustrates it can be done if people want to do it. But in the digital world, there's no excuse whatsoever. And I think this one-size-fits-all approach I find deeply frustrating. But I think that's illustrative of the overall point I'm trying to make in the book, which is we don't think about the people at the end of this. We sort of we solve problems quickly and efficiently. So let's have one rule that will apply globally. Well, there are going to be exceptions to that rule. And so we should be trying to think about those, because if we don't, then the rule becomes ineffective. Either it misses things completely. And as I talk in the book, if it doesn't tell you can't do something, the more rules we have, ironically, that can make the world more dangerous, because if something isn't if a big fat rule book, if something isn't in there, people will naturally assume that they can do it because you've written a ton of rules. So if you'd meant for that not to be permitted, then you would have put a rule in there, and you haven't. And so I think on the one hand, we like these one size fits all things because it's clear, it's simple. We can just deliver one message to everybody or deliver one product to everybody. But actually that's missing something, because humans are complex and challenging. And so, yeah, I think what I'm highlighting is these things are a lot harder. But if we want to have a more inclusive, more effective society, mitigate risks properly, we need to be thinking in those terms.
You and I have been to many cooking classes, both together and separately. And there's a question that's always asked in a cooking class, and you may never have noticed it, but I always notice it because I'm always on the receiving end of it. And the question is anybody left-handed? And I will put my hand up, and I will 9 times out of 10 be moved to a different part of wherever I'm based to the end where I can't stab anyone, at least of all myself, right? So if everyone is using their knife in their right hand and I'm the person next to you using it in their left hand, that's 2 knives in very close proximity, which is a danger, which I understand, but there is a different way of making the point. And it's right, just some safety, okay? Right-handed people, right? We want to go right hand, right hand, right hand, right hand. If we've got any left-handed people, we'll put those together. What we don't want is knives in close proximity with each other. It's never mentioned like that. It's always any potential stabbers in the room, right? We're going to move you.
Right, you're the problem.
Yeah, you're the problem. I'm immediately singled out of the problem. And the problem is then compounded by the fact that in a situation like that, everyone else will laugh and find it funny and will join in and going left-handed, stab victim,
Right.
stab alert, and it's fine and it's funny and I get it, but I remember it, right? And it's fascinating being on the receiving end of that sort of. I get the point you're trying to make, right? We are using incredibly sharp knives and everyone needs to take care. But I've also been at cookery classes where in demonstrating knife safety, a chef has cut his finger, right? Which, of course, all the other chefs find absolutely hilarious. And I actually felt really sorry for this guy, because I've been on the receiving end of that. Now, he actually cut himself. I have cut myself before, as other people have. But it's one thing to talk about safety, and it's another thing to make somebody who is paying for this product, this service, for this piece of their luxury time, right? But all time is luxury, but it's a piece of their time that they're not working, that they have paid to be in this establishment to learn a skill, to be made to feel bad about the fact that they happen to be left-handed. And I find that extraordinary that we understand why we're doing something. It's the risk, but the way we communicate that is that left equals bad. The Latin word for left is sinister.
Right.
I mean, there you are. Right, dexter is right, dexterous is good, sinister is sinister. And I always think about things like that, because that, for me, I am a living example of behavioural science, because I am on the receiving end of right-handed convention. And I find that, every day, you come across it and you get used to it. And I also happen to compound my own problem because I'm really clumsy, right? Which doesn't help me. Which doesn't help me at all. But being clumsy and left-handed are not the same thing. I happen to be both, therefore it gets lumped together as the same thing.
But it's interesting there because that's visible, right? You notice it, but there'll be lots of other things that we don't. And I think as we look at technology and AI and all of these questions, I think we need to be really, really careful that for all the visible things we talk about and the visible prejudice that's there are a lot of other things that are hidden. And I think there are going to be situations in which we for the convenience of someone, we put people in situations that make them feel awkward or embarrassed or ashamed. And the idea of, I sort of think about, you were talking about as an adult, you recognize this. I mean, there are kids that are going through this whole piece. And that story you told about pick the childhood photo. I mean, it's so obviously not to go through. And yet, it's well-intentioned. They're probably not thinking, they're not deliberately going, how can we create a game that's going to isolate this person? The cooking schools are not going, how can we make Mark feel really awkward? Because if they were, there's a lot more things they could do. But, it's not an intentional process. And I think we have to start being much more human about the way that we go and do things. And I think, the reason I like the word humanizing is that's what we need to do. And lots of these things feel inhumane. And it's not necessary. That's the bit that I find astonishing. So many examples that we could solve these problems nowadays. And we're aware of them, and yet we're not doing anything about it. And so that's, you beautifully understood what I think the broader church. And as I look at what the next book might look like, I think some of these topics are quite interesting to say, well, where else do we need to humanize things?
The biggest single negative impact on my education was when the school that I attended, the big school, the college that I attended, changed furniture. And it went from having desks, tables like the one we're all sat at, where everyone has their own bit of workspace, to those, and people listening will know this, if you wandered into a lecture hall and there are seats, and on the side of the seat is a bit of plastic or wood or whatever it is that can be lifted up, a bit like an arm of a chair, on which you can put your book or your pad and you can write. There were no left-handed versions of those chairs in that setup in the school that I went to. Not one. Meaning that I, as a left-handed person, had to reach across myself to write, because the thing I was supposed to put my pad on to write was on the right-hand side, not the left. And that meant that my arm would ache significantly quicker than it would if I'd have had a conventional thing. That was a significantly detrimental impact to me. And it was brushed off as being insignificant, completely insignificant. So now, whenever I go to a lecture hall to give a presentation or to talk to people who did the same course that I did, and I've gone back, I've been invited back to talk about life in the wild, life on the outside, and what it's like, I make a point of saying, anybody left-handed in the audience, and if anyone puts their hands up, I always say, I am very sorry on behalf of the establishment that has hired me to be here, that you have to put up with what you put up with. And on 100% of the occasions, that person will come up to me at the end and say, thank you for acknowledging that this is a problem. And so when you see this every day, maybe this is the next book, right? Maybe this is what it's like to be other, what it's like to be sinister, what it's like to sort of live in that world. You mentioned something earlier about AI, and I'm glad you did, because I want to touch on it. I think it's an appropriate time to move on to this. There is a distinct probability that these preconceptions that humans have will filter through to AI, because AI can only do what human beings tell it. You've done a lot of work thinking about AI and what it can teach us from a compliance and ethics, a behavioural sense. So first question, are you worried by what you see?
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, because I think the scale of it is the challenge here. And so I was looking into what are the risks posed by AI, because you can get very carried away with the excitement of all things it can do, and isn't it amazing? It's going to free us up. But the risks are that we're unleashing something that feels human, that has a huge amount of the bigger data sets than any of us can cope with in our heads, that is being unleashed in all sorts of different ways, and we can't fully get our heads around what it might be used for. There's no sense of, none of these things have been created with a restrictive mindset or a kind of compliance or an ethics mindset. It's that classic, we see this with tech companies. They design things without thinking about the consequences, because it's exciting. And one of the things I talk about in the book is just because you can doesn't mean you should. Let's have a look at what happened with Facebook. Right? I can make a very legitimate argument saying social media is a great thing, allows you to stay in contact with your school friends. So that's the genesis of where Facebook comes from. And yet we then saw through Cambridge Analytica that the scalability of these things, the fact that it's digital, so it's individual. It is not something that's being done in full view of everybody. What your experience of social media will be different to my experience of social media. And so as I look at AI, I think the risks it poses is the asymmetry between the AI. If you imagine an AI salesperson talking to you, and let's go a few years hence when it's got the capability to read your face and read your reactions. The AI will constantly be building up an impression of you, what works for you, and we'll be able to, a sales bot, if you like, would be able to target you very, very specifically, and it'll get smarter and smarter. We know absolutely nothing about the bots. So every conversation we have, it's giving nothing away about itself, and yet we're giving away a ton of stuff about ourselves. So I'm fearful because the lack of visibility, the fact that we don't fully understand what's going on, the fact that we've got lots of examples of tech being brought in without people fully thinking through the consequences. So if you add all that together, it's not a particularly rosy picture. On the other hand, I'm really excited about it, right? And I think we sometimes lull ourselves into a false sense of, well, it's just like it's another thing that's going to help make the world better. It's almost like it's like electricity or some major game-changing thing. I'm worried about what it's going to do to us on a cognitive level, and I don't think we have the capabilities to work out the worst of what might happen. And so I don't want to paint a kind of doomsday scenario, but I think we've got to be really, really careful.
Yes, because we are at risk of putting all of our misconceptions, preconceptions, prejudices, biases into a bot, which means that the bot will react the way that we react, potentially in an even worse and more destructive way. And I can completely understand and live in a world in which this could have huge advantages. I really can. And if one of those advantages is it does a whole bunch of grunt work so that humans, back to your book, so that human beings are more empowered to either make decisions or to be more informed or to be safer, etc., then great. But as we've seen from technology, for every one good thing that technology can do, there are 1,000, maybe even more, bad things that it can do, right? And so the more we propagate this through society, the more potential bad things could end up. And you talked about crypto. That's just the thin end of the wedge, isn't it? Right? There is a huge amount of potential destruction that can be caused, particularly on the Cambridge Analytica point. The ability of technology to influence the way you think, the way you act, the way you vote, the way you do everything, the way you live your life is incredibly dangerous, as well as being incredibly advantageous at the same time. So I'm kind of massively conflicted as to where we should go.
And it's interesting when you think about human attributes that the AI doesn't have. So let's take shame, for example. One of the things that stops us doing silly things is that we're embarrassed. And so there's a natural calibration that would mean if you do something that stands out, that you will feel, people will look at you. And that we know has a very powerful thing. We don't like lots of people staring at us. We don't like to be the odd one out. Back to your point around being left-handed. Part of the reason I think that's a challenge is not just the physical issue you have, but you're being singled out and you're being ignored. And so that doesn't feel very human. So when we know that a lot of our behavior is calibrated by some of these features that the human OS comes with. So peer pressure, very, very powerful. So it can be negative, but has a very powerful constraining force to stop us doing silly things. There's none of that in the AI. There aren't some of these intangibles. And so what we're doing is taking, if you like, we're replicating bits of our brain, making them better. So it can do bigger calculations. It can read more stuff. It can process it. It doesn't get tired. So it's kind of turbocharging the human brain without some of these compensating factors. And I think one of the things that I find really interesting about the human brain is that on the one hand, we can point to all the flaws in it and say, well, people make stupid decisions. And so let's take human decision-making out of it. The term human error, classic example of, well, let's give it to the machine because the machines never make mistakes. But actually, the human brain has weaknesses in it, but it's also very, very sophisticated in the sense that we have these compensating factors. We've got inbuilt things that adrenaline rush to get us out of trouble. Lots of those things. None of those things get put into the AI. So we're taking part of the human brain because we can't add those extra bits in. And so for me, the risk there is that we turbocharge just one part of it, and the risk management features in our brain don't get carried with it. And that I think is the real threat here, in that because we don't know what that looks like. We don't know what the extremities could be without some of those risk management capabilities.
There are many reasons that listeners should, if they haven't already, buy and then more importantly read, perhaps more importantly buy, but no, more importantly read the book. One in particular that I picked up on is that the extraordinary, once in a hopefully lifetime experience, the backdrop in which you wrote this book was perhaps the biggest single behavioural science experiment ever. And I would love to live in a world in which it's never repeated again, and which was the pandemic and the way that we were forced, not encouraged, but forced to comply with certain processes and customs and behaviors. What did we learn, do you think, with that golden opportunity of an experiment? Did we learn good things, bad things, or a mixture of the two?
I think we learned a ton of things, and we're still learning more things, right? Because we talk about the pandemic like it's over. I think it has scarred all of us, and we all sort of think back to, and it was what, 3 years ago as we record this. It in a way it feels like COVID and those issues they've been with us forever, and it also feels like it's sort of, that was a period of time where, I'm starting to have rose-tinted memories of what was locked, because I had a very, as you did, right, a very privileged lockdown in the sense of didn't have to go anywhere, just forced to stay at home, and an opportunity to do some interesting things and to explore new hobbies and all sorts of things. So I look at that and I think it had such a fundamental, and it's the only thing I think that's impacted every single person on the planet in some way, shape, or form. And we saw governments having to react and did things and imposing rules on people. And so not only is it the world's largest behavioural science experiment, it's probably the world's largest compliance experiment as well. And so we all started to have views on things. And so for me, it's, at a simple level, there's a narrative there where I can talk to people about, if I want a perfect example that I know every single person in a room is going to understand, I'll talk about COVID restrictions. Because every single person experienced it, they have a view on it. They will have complied with some things, not completely. Nobody was 100% compliant. And so there are lots of little microcosms of stories, and there's lots of research going on as to what worked and what didn't. And the key message that comes out from all of that research is it depends. It depends on your individual circumstances. It depends on the culture that you're in. It depends how you were impacted personally by it. And so it's a beautiful illustration, I think, of the challenges of influencing human decision making, is that humans are complex creatures. And so I would say we learned some incredible lessons about people's capability to make fundamental changes to their lives but we also learned that humans get tired of things after a while, and they get bored of things. And if they don't trust the government, the fascinating research for UK listeners, if you look at what was the impact of Barnard Castle. So for overseas listeners, this was Dominic Cummings, who was Boris Johnson's right-hand man, the power behind the throne in many people's view. He basically was found to have broken COVID rules and came up with a whole load of feeble excuses. And everybody in government sort of stood behind this and said, yeah, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And we all know it wasn't a reasonable thing to do. We all know he broke the rules. That had a major impact in terms of UK compliance levels, because people suddenly went, oh, okay, we're not all in this together. And so I think there's lots of case studies and illustrations like that where we can say there's some serious lessons to be, and we're still learning those lessons. But I think what we saw is the ability to influence, this human's propensity to comply with rules. There are a ton of factors that go into that. And so I think we're still learning these pieces. So for me, it's been you're right. It helped crystallize many of the thoughts in the book, because I think not least the publisher's willingness to publish it. They suddenly went, oh, lots of publishers prior to that had said to me, we don't really understand what compliance is. We sort of know, but suddenly they all got it. And so from the perspective, being able to publish the book, I think was helped hugely by it.
And I think you've put yourself in an interesting and advantageous but also difficult position, because this book and the examples in it, there is a danger that they will date very, very quickly, because there is no shortage of stupid people doing stupid things to give you examples. So I think that this strikes me as the sort of book that is a snapshot in time, which is right now, of bringing behavioural science to ethics and compliance as we see the world today, but the way the world was 3 years ago. And I'll give you one example. I was recently asked by someone, what's a good answer to, if I'm having an interview, what's a good answer to the usual crappy, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time question? I said, that's very easy. I said, because I answered this the other day, and here's what I said. I said, I would advise you to say, if you'd have asked me that question 3 years ago, or even 5 years ago, I would have been 100% wrong, as would every single person on the planet, because of what's happened. So on the basis that might happen again, I'm going to politely decline the opportunity to answer that question. But that's what I think we're dealing with here, is that I think people should read this book, and I think they'll learn a huge amount from it. But what I've certainly done is started to think about the way I conduct myself, the way I see the world, the way I feel about being in the world, but also it is just a snapshot, because you could revisit this in 3 years' time and we would potentially be learning different things. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that, but I think there's also, I picked things that were within living memory, relatively recent, to try and make it, salient to the audience. But I think some of these dynamics have been around for a long time. You can go back and look at sort of, stories that are told in the Bible about human decision making that are still valid. There's a reason that book has sustained itself over a period of time. So I think if I were writing a book that was designed to be read in 100 years' time, I probably should have picked older stories. So you're right, I was trying to speak to a 21st century audience. And my hope is that we get more sophisticated about this, and that almost the lessons that I'm trying to communicate in the book and the ways of thinking in the book become a bit more embedded. I would like to think that as we get smarter about things, and there are certain contexts in which the ideas I put in the book are natural. Advertising is a good example. You don't get to spend a ton of money on an ad campaign if you don't have some idea as to why it is likely to succeed. Whereas if you took a compliance program within an organization, you're allowed to essentially do the same thing. You're not spending money on billboards and TV ads and online ads, but you're wasting people's time. And so you're allowed to do something there, and your rationale can just be, well, that's what everybody else is doing, or it's what we've always done, or I don't know, but we think this kind of works. We've no evidence it doesn't work. And I don't think that's good enough. And so I would hope that and not all advertisers are great at this, but they're at least further ahead. And so I would hope that people who are allowed to use resources, and I mean that in every single sense of the word, in a resource-constrained environment, ought to be thinking about, is that a good use of people's time? Is it why are we doing what we're doing? And I think, one of the benefits of technology and AI and social media is transparency around these things. So we can highlight stupid processes, idiotic decision-making much more than we ever could before. We can shine lights on it and embarrass people. And so I would hope that we can move things on a little bit and recognize that we can do better.
Well, we could do a lot worse than start with this book. Thank you very much, Christian Hunt. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.